good morning. If you're just now joining us, my name is Zach Miane, and I am one of the clergy at St. Bartholomew's Church in the city of New York. Situated at the corner of Park Avenue and 50th Street, we are a radically welcoming Christian community and part of the Episcopal Church. During Pride Month in June, we are glad to be offering this Faith in Full Color Instagram series at the intersection of faith, spirituality, and LGBTQ plus conversations. Today's guest is my friend and colleague, the Reverend Senator Kim Jackson. Kim is the first openly LGBTQ plus person of color to be ordained a priest in the Diocese of Atlanta, and the first LGBTQ plus person to be elected to the state senate in the state of Georgia. She also serves as Vicar of the Church of the Common Ground, a church without walls made up of, by, for, and among people experiencing homelessness in downtown Atlanta. She resides with her wife, Trina, in Stone Mountain, Georgia. Kim, welcome.
Hey, Zach, it's good to see you.
Well, it's an honor to have you with us today. And happy Eve of Juneteenth, by the way.
Yes, thank you.
Well, just to jump right into it, did you always want to be a priest? Did you always want to be a public servant? And how did all of that come to be?
Yeah, so, always no, but for a very, very long time, I've wanted to be a priest. I felt called to ministry when I was just 8 years old. I didn't grow up in the Episcopal Church, though, so I grew up in a Baptist tradition, and so, the idea of a priest wasn't necessarily on my radar, but I knew I wanted to pastor, that I wanted to make a difference in the world. But I was raised in a tradition that didn't ordain women, and so I remember, being 8 and going to my pastor and saying, I want to be, a pastor. And he said to me, girls can't be pastors. To which I responded, of course not. When I'm a woman, I want to be a pastor.
Yes.
And then he gave me some weird theological response about how women also couldn't be pastors. They had to have a man over them or something. But, I was 8, so I believed him, and really kind of went on growing up believing that, well, the next best thing is to be an educator, to be a teacher. So I actually went to college to be a teacher. But simultaneous to that, I did also want to go into elected office. When I was about 13 years old, I went to a city council meeting in my hometown. And this is how I know representation matters, because we had our very first Black mayor who was serving, and I saw this person, serving in the role of mayor in my city council. And I had that light bulb moment at 13 of, public office is how you make change. If you want to make a positive difference in the world, one of the ways that you do that is through elected office. And there wasn't anybody who could tell me that as a woman, I couldn't do it, right? Because there were women up there and there were Black people up there. So those kind of developed within me simultaneously over the course of my, teenage years and young adulthood. And I'm really grateful for college chaplains. Zach, I served as a college chaplain in part because my college chaplain, when I was just 18, saw gifts of ministry in me and said, Kim, you can do this. And let me introduce you to women who are doing it, because I know you don't believe that. And so he really did inspire me to follow this call that I'd had for a very long time.
That's awesome. And then you were elected to the state senate in 2020, 21?
2020?
It's all a blur, the past few years. Tell us about that. What made you decide, now's the time and I'm going to do this?
Yeah, I had people who came to me and said, listen, your seat's going to be open. I know you've talked about this. So I went actually, Zach and I used to serve in the same parish. And I went to this meeting with some senior women. They were probably all in their 70s or so. And I didn't know. I thought it was just a nice conversation, but they basically were interviewing me. And they asked me, Kim, in 10 years from now, where do you see yourself being? And I was like, well, I want to be an elected official. I want to work in the state capitol. 10 years from now, we're still nowhere near that 10-year mark. But I said that, they heard that, and so they started telling other people. And when the seat that I live in became open, people came to me and said hey, we know you want to do this. We know this isn't necessarily the timeline that you've thought about, but it's an open seat. We think you have the gifts and skills to do it. And so I think you should do it. And I'm glad I took that advice.
That's so amazing. And what's the experience been like for you so far? What's been good? What's been challenging? What are you working on these days?
Yeah. I mean, the challenge has been COVID, right? Like I've been serving in elected office the entire time that COVID has been here. And so that's its own difficulty. Um, and also this is just a politically fraught time for our country and particularly for my state. So, dealing with issues of voting rights and access to the ballot box, not being able to really make sure we protect that access has been a challenge. Working to try to ensure healthcare for Georgians and being a part of a government that just refuses to expand Medicaid has been frustrating and troubling, and I think fundamentally antithetical to what it is to love your neighbor. So that's all been hard. But I've also been working, on other issues that we can get along together on. And so I passed a bill that allows people who are victims of stalking to get out of their lease without any penalties and to be able to move. That way, if your stalker knows where you live, they won't know because you can move, right? And so that's been great. We've done some really good criminal justice reform issues and measures. In Georgia, our average probation sentence is 8 years, whereas in the country it's 3. So we did some reform to pass some laws that allow you to get terminated at 3 years if you haven't had any problems. And so that feels really good. And right now I'm working on some issues around getting IDs into the hands of people who are formerly incarcerated. My belief is if we can lock you up and take away your freedom for 1 to 20 or 30 years, then the least we can do is give you an ID when you leave, and so that you can get a fresh start. So that's my big initiative right now.
It's so great. And I imagine a lot of that work feels resonant with your work as vicar at Church of the Common Ground. Tell us, for those who don't know, what is the Church of the Common Ground? Like, when do you meet? What's it about? Who's it for?
Yeah.
What does it look like?
Yeah, so we are a church without walls. So that means that we don't have a building. We do have offices that we're blessed to be able to use at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in downtown Atlanta. But we go out to the streets. So we have service every Sunday in Woodruff Park, which is kind of a park in downtown where a lot of people hang out, but also sleep. And so we create church together in that space. And we have members, the Common Ground's been around for almost 15 years. We have folks who once were formerly unhoused who are now housed, but Common Ground is still their church. So they come and worship with us downtown. And then during the week, we have Bible study and morning prayer. I mean, we do church, right? That's what we do. And alongside that, we also do a foot clinic. We now have a foot clinic on Mondays and Tuesdays because many of our congregants walk many, many miles every day in order to get the services that they need. And so we do what Jesus did. We wash people's feet every Monday and every Tuesday and care for them so that they can continue to do the work that they have to do in order to survive.
I was so impressed. The last time I heard you speak in public was a few months ago at a conference of Episcopalians, and you were actually up on stage with Bernice King. It was a really great conversation. I think candidly, if you were to look up Bernice King, we would find that she's perhaps evolved some on her stances towards the LGBTQ plus community, and kind of it's been a journey for her. What I was so impressed with is the way that you're seemingly not afraid to just kind of tackle hard issues directly, and the winsome way in which I think you were able to kind of go to maybe a scary space in that conversation, sort of right off the bat with a fearlessness. And in this conversation, you started talking about what you'd been learning at Church of the Common Ground from the sex workers who you minister with and to. Tell us about that.
Yeah. I mean, I minister with them and they minister to me. And
Mhm.
it's a beautiful kind of thing. I was talking about the ways in which I have come to understand community in a much more clear way as I've watched they're often women and trans women, trans identified women, who have created this like safe space for each other where they really look out for each other. They're doing work that can be really dangerous, right? But I've watched them look out for each other in a way that I just don't see replicated anywhere else, right? So they tend to kind of camp in the same general areas. They know to look out for each other. They know that if danger comes their way, I had a woman tell me like, and she's a beautiful like young Black trans woman, and I mean she probably is not more than 18 or 19 years old, to be honest. But something went really wrong and she ran to an older woman's tent in 3 o'clock in the morning and like basically yelled and said, please let me in. And nobody lets anybody in a tent at 3 o'clock in the morning except for women who are sex workers who know what the sound of trouble is. And so they opened up that tent, let her in, closed that tent up, and really helped protect her and save her, right? So it's just beautiful, I think, for me to see what community can look like and how we can care for each other. And I think that those sex workers show me that and teach me those lessons every day.
That's so powerful, this idea that marginalized communities and people already experience something of profoundly deep Christian community, you might even say. Christ, even if you don't use that language or have any formal association with the church, there's a realness to that sense of loving, caring community. And sometimes as church, I think we get in a little bit of trouble in this idea that, oh, we need to welcome the marginalized and welcome in LGBTQ people, welcome in poor folk, welcome in the oppressed so that they can experience God and Christ. No, they're already like experiencing
Exactly.
it and have something to teach us. It reminds me of the beautiful poem that's been circulating by Jay Kuhn, Jesus at the Gay Bar, right? That for all the people that the church has kicked out, so often the communities that we've kicked out have formed their own community that is in many ways just as sacred as what we do on Sunday mornings. And of course, Church of the Common Ground kind of melds the Sunday church worship experience and blesses and affirms the other ways in which community is also forming out in the world. Thank you, Kim. That's really powerful witness. My colleague Peter Thompson says you and Raphael Warnock are both currently serving in Georgia. You're both also public officials. Do you think that we'll start seeing more clergy, especially progressive clergy, in politics?
Yeah, I hope so. That's certainly a message that I go out and encourage people to do. Whether that's, I talk a lot less about running for office as a clergy person because that's hard. It's complicated. There are all kinds of hurdles and obstacles that not all clergy can overcome as it relates to that, particularly in terms of being able to serve a congregation simultaneously. But I do very much hope and ask and encourage clergy, progressive clergy, to get involved in kind of local politics, making sure they're showing up for committee meetings for, whether that's a city council, your school board, on the state level. The reality is it's often been a really conservative Christian voice that has showed up in political spaces, and that's been the dominant voice and representation for Christianity, and that has ultimately really hurt us. I think that's hurt our nation writ large, and so I really am hopeful. And I do think that having really visible people like Raphael Warnock, Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock, showing that example of what a progressive Christian can be on a national stage will help encourage other clergy and people of faith in general, right, to get involved in issues of politics.
Yeah, I think that's part of the narrative that often gets forgotten more and more about Martin Luther King Jr. Of course, he was primarily a pastor, and he really led with that. Sometimes I think the culture has kind of diminished the role that his faith played, but of course, those of us who are in the church and know the tradition, like, know that his speeches and his work were completely infused with this Christian theological imagination about the kingdom of God and beloved community, and the world that God dreams for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think of John Lewis too, right? Who's another Georgia legend. And we talk about the Honorable John Lewis, but he was the Reverend John Lewis. He was an ordained pastor who was seminary educated. And for particularly in the Black church tradition, there has been a long legacy of seminary educated, theologically trained and ordained for persons engaging in the public square, because we understand that that's one of the best ways that we can help love our neighbor well.
So Kim, we have a question here from Caden. Have you guys ever experienced criticism from conservative Christian leaders? And I might add to that, would you reflect a little bit just on, like, who is Jesus to you? And why does your faith matter in this work? I think that, I suspect that sometimes conservative Christians will look at progressives and kind of say, oh, well, they're not real Christians. They're just using Jesus to, promote their own political opinions. How does Jesus inform your work? And how might he be even central to it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that Jesus is very much central to the work that I do as both a clergy person and also as a state senator. The Jesus that I understand and I love and follow is a Jesus who offered healing to anybody without asking for their papers, without asking, hey, do you have a job, right? There was never any kind of prerequisites to having access to healthcare. And the same Jesus I know fed 5,000 people, again, no questions asked. Now, there was no work requirement put on being able to receive food from that Jesus. Jesus preached a message of liberation, right? And so when I think about issues where people are not free, I mean, this is what we should be thinking about this weekend in particular as we celebrate Juneteenth, right? Jesus called us to set the oppressed free. And for me, that translates into really thinking clearly and theologically about issues around mass incarceration. Those are some of the people who are most clearly not free, right? Most clearly not liberated. I mean, I would argue that those of us who, if you can't afford to pay your bills, that there's a sense of oppression there too. But most clearly, people who are not free are those who are incarcerated. And Jesus called us to really figure out ways to set the captives free. And so I'm constantly thinking about how do we reform the criminal justice system so that as many people who can safely be in our neighborhoods, right, safely be in our communities, how we can make sure that they are free. So much of my policy is oriented towards thinking about the message of Jesus, which is a liberating message. It's a message of human rights, right? That you as a human, as a child of God, should be able to have healing, right? You as a human, by virtue of being around in that time, should have access to food. And so that's really the core for me. And yes, I do get criticized. I get criticized quite often from conservative Christians, particularly when they find out that I'm gay, right? There's still a lot of stigma around being queer in the South, queer as a clergy person. I've had conservative Christians say to me, like, we don't really care if you were gay and like did other work, but the fact that you're gay and, call yourself a so-called pastor, that's a quote, right, does lead to some criticism. And I hear that. And I've been really clear, Zach, that it's not my job to decide who's a Christian, who isn't. And so people question my Christianity all the time and say, you're not really a Christian. And I refuse to go back in that, right? Like, if you identify as a Christian, even though we might follow Christ in really different ways, I'm going to respect that you've identified in that way and hope that we can actually come to the table, because we do have a commonality in being followers of Jesus, to begin to work through some of our issues.
It strikes me how so often, conservative evangelicals will read very literally and dogmatically, maybe things like the 7-day creation and the role of men and women in Genesis, or statements about same-sex behavior, from some of the Pauline epistles and so forth, so literally and directly. But then what you're saying is maybe we should start taking Jesus's words seriously. We're so quick sometimes to spiritualize setting the captives free. No, like, we actually need to be thinking about criminal justice reform and mass incarceration. Maybe instead of thinking about spiritually feeding people, we need to remember that there are people whose bodies are hungry at the same time. So I really appreciate that. I know even, I think in progressive circles, we can over-spiritualize this notion of freedom and liberation, and so forth. So that's really powerful. Can you point to any, and it's okay if not, but can you point to any successes that you found kind of working across the aisle, either in a bipartisan way or even multi-faith partnerships that you've been able to forge out in the wider community?
Yeah, so one of the bills that I worked on really hard this last session was around death by suicide for public servants. So people who are EMTs, firefighters, law enforcement, and I found an incredible amount of bipartisan support around trying to make sure that those families receive a death benefit in the event that happens. And I mean, suicide is a very complicated issue. It's heartbreaking. It's something we don't talk about often enough. But I've served as an EMT, and so I bring a certain amount of street cred with me to that issue. And so Republicans who served as law enforcement officers and firefighters, when I brought the issue to them and said, like, people's families need to be cared for, they got it. And we were able to really, and it's interesting because even those, I mean, I had a Republican colleague who said to me, like, Kim, I can't vote for your bill because I'm Catholic and we don't believe in suicide. To which I responded, believing in suicide is like not a thing. This is not what's happening. We're not saying we believe in suicide. What we're saying is we believe and we understand that when a person regularly encounters trauma, and that's what, I mean, think about an EMT, right? EMTs show up for the most traumatic of events in people's lives. And so we understand that when you are encountering significant amounts of trauma, that there is a cost to that. There's a mental health cost. And we have a responsibility as a state to make sure we provide mental health care and access to mental health care treatment. And in the event that fails and we fall through the cracks, we still owe it to those families to care for them, just like we care for any other family. If a law enforcement officer dies from a heart attack while on duty, right? Like, we care for them. If a firefighter dies from cancer that we know they got from going into fires, we pay for that. And so we need to do the same for death by suicide. And they got it. Like, they really got it. They understood in a place of empathy, right? It wasn't about, like, we didn't connect at the fiscal level. We didn't connect about, like, it was never about money. It was never about where we landed theologically on what happens when somebody dies by suicide, right? Because that is a rich theological question. Where we connected was around empathy for the families that are left behind. And that was just a really beautiful experience for me to be able to connect across the lines in that cause.
That's so beautiful. And I mean, it strikes me that although the death benefit factor isn't, necessarily part of the equation, but suicide is something that so deeply affects so many in the LGBTQ plus community, especially thinking about trans youth, but so many others. And I know that you've encountered that in your experience in kind of ministry and chaplaincy as well. So coming into our last few minutes here, so if you have any questions for Kim, please do pop them in the chat. Kim, who are some of your kind of heroes and saints that you look to for inspiration?
So first and foremost, it's the Reverend Polly Murray. So Reverend Polly Murray, who is a saint now, I guess, in the Episcopal Church, was the first African-American at that time kind of identified as a woman who was ordained in the Episcopal Church. But even more meaningful to me is that she really lived this bridge between engaging with public policy and being a woman of faith, and being really clear that as a person of faith and as a queer person, I use the language of woman, but but, Polly went by, they and he at times. And so being this queer person who really embraced a calling to be both a legal scholar and a clergy person, right? A person who says, like, we need to examine not just the policies of the world that create segregation and create kind of two class or three classes of citizens, but they also brought that into the church and said, like, we also need to consider the church's policies and why our policies are what they are in terms of discriminating against whether or not women can be ordained, right? Polly Murray was in that kind of first wave of women identified folks who were ordained, right? And so Polly is definitely the saint that inspires me most. I was sworn in wearing a stole that's been passed down from Polly Murray because I very much understand myself to be standing on her shoulders and understand her to be a part of the great cloud of witnesses that prays and watches over me.
Oh, that's awesome. And I noticed there's a great interview that you did with the Polly Murray Center online. So folks, if you want to Google that, just Kim Jackson, Polly Murray Center, and really rich transcript there. That's amazing that you were able to wear her stole. That is so cool.
Yeah.
And of course, there's I think an Amazon Prime documentary on Polly that folks can pick up right now. They just named one of the new colleges, kind of dormitory centers at Yale after them, I might say.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize that she used that Polly used they them pronouns at times.
I think they most often used she he, right? So like the old school, we don't really do that much anymore.
Gotcha.
But that was the most we saw that often in Polly's writings, was the she / he. Yeah.
Cutting edge, a plurality of pronouns, and Kim, it strikes me just that you are such both and yes and person in an either or world. I mean, you have this amazing ministry in which you are queer and a pastor. You're a pastor and a public servant. You are a Christian, and your wife Trina is Muslim.
Yeah.
And a leader at that in that tradition. You have a bi-vocational ministry. You are Vicar of Common Ground and Senator. And to me, that's such just a liberating embodiment that you represent, because it tells us all that, we don't always have to make a choice. We can embrace a sacred complexity in our vocations and our identities, and trust that God loves us and meets us just as we are, right where we are.
Yeah.
Let's see. I do want to honor one final question from Caden. What things are you looking to accomplish when it comes to disabled people's rights?
Oh, thank you for that question. So I've been pretty focused on issues of voting rights, and you could actually, I think if you go to my YouTube channel, you'll be able to see I gave a speech from the well about making sure that people with disabilities have access to the ballot, and talk about the ways that we heard very clearly during our hearings on voting from people who were from the visually impaired community about the ways that our machines just completely fail them when it comes to voting. They just cannot read the screen. So how can you exercise your right to vote if we don't provide screens? And so I've been really fighting hard to get those machines redone, or at least they just need a software update so that people's phones, their readers, can connect to the phone, because people who are visually impaired often have phones that will read for them. But we also have to change the laws to allow a person who's visually impaired to be able to bring their phone into the ballot box, into the booth, because right now that's illegal. And so I speak to that issue as well. And so I tend to kind of focus on, like, where can disability rights intersect with these other policies that I'm thinking about really deeply. And so voting has been one of those. And I will continue to really push, and have been very grateful to particularly the visually impaired and blind community for the ways that they've rallied around me and asked me to help them to push these initiatives so that they can have access to voting. And that goes also into their ability to vote from home, and wanting to be able to have a caretaker read their ballot for them. Right now, that's illegal to have. You have to have like your mom or your spouse, or like it has to be someone who's very closely related to you who helps you fill out your ballot. And many people who are visually impaired and blind are independent, right? They don't have to live with a family member, which is great. And they want to be able to have a friend or a caretaker to help them with their ballot at home. And so those are kind of the things that I'm really working on as it relates to disability rights.
Fantastic. Well, this has been such a rich conversation at the intersection, not only of LGBTQ issues and faith, but really justice writ large, and becoming the beloved community that God dreams for us. So, Kim, thank you so much for your time. I wonder if you would be so kind and brave as to send us out with a word of blessing.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think I want to conclude this time with this reminder. God has created us all in all of our complexities and has called us beloved. So as you go out into the world and you encounter people who are complex in a way that is contrasting to who you are, remember that they too are beloved. And therefore, we have a responsibility to treat one another with kindness and love and generosity in the same ways that God treats us. Go forth and be blessed and bless others. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, Zach. Really great to see you.
Thank you so much. It's been awesome. And for our audience, I hope you'll join us again next Saturday. I'll be talking to Miles Markham, who's been working on the Netflix documentary Pray Away. And then next Sunday is Pride Sunday. We'll have as our guest at the Forum here at St. Bart's at 10 a.m. Actress Jane Lynch, who will be talking about being out in theater. Then we'll be joined at our 11 o'clock service with guest preacher Julie Rogers, a former chaplain at Wheaton College, who wrote the book Out Love, a queer Christian survival story, and has also been featured on the Netflix documentary Pray Away, talking about her experience with conversion therapy. So Pride Month continues, and we press on. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.